Helena. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, the incredible Dr. Temple Grandin. Her work has impacted my practice of veterinary medicine and how I interact with my own pets, as well as how my husband and I raise our own cattle. Dr. Temple Grandin is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University, teaching courses on livestock handling and facility design. She has been a pioneer in improving the handling and welfare. Half of the cattle in the U.S. and Canada are handled in equipment she designed for meat plants. In addition, she has developed animal welfare guidelines for the meat industry and consulted with countless companies on animal welfare. Following her PhD research, she published several hundred industry publications, book chapters, and technical papers on handling, plus 73 refereed journal articles in addition to 12 books. Hopefully she'll sign mine today. And there she is. And in case you haven't noticed, there are a lot of books available out there for you to purchase.
You gotta put this over here.
Okay. We'll give her just a minute to get settled in. What's that?
Okay, have to get started here because I definitely do believe in the separation of water and electronics. There's no place here to put the water without it getting all over the computer, which would be very bad for the computer. So, a lot of things to talk about today. Ed's doing some wonderful, wonderful research. That was a great presentation that he gave, and it's going to fit in very well with some of the things I'm going to talk about. And I was especially interested in the data that he had on the experienced animal. You know, I have found if you put animals through a handling procedure, it might be uncomfortable, but they will habituate to that. And I've seen the behavior where the bulls settle down in the pens. In fact, I was up at the Calgary Stampede with Ed, and at our Denver stock show. The thing that was really interesting is that little kids would be there petting the killer of the bull at the Denver stock show. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do. But if you treat them too badly and they go in that chute, they're not going to go back in again. Because I did a paper where I looked at cattle going through the squeeze chute that were being weighed, and sometimes they'd accidentally bump one of the animals on the head. Then 30 days later, he had to go back and go in the squeeze chute again, like 4 times. And the ones that got smashed on the head accidentally, they did not want to put their head in the head gate. They remembered. And I also, unfortunately, had the chance to see some cattle where maybe a few too many students had palpated them, and those cattle absolutely didn't want to go back in the chute. The thing that amazed me about the bucking animals, when they're done right, is they were really willing to go back into the chute. Now, a question came up with a person sitting next to me about pain in cattle. They cover it up. Sheep are even worse about covering it up. Is there a prey species animal? You don't want to advertise the predators out there that you're hurting. But I had an experience that absolutely showed this covering up behavior. You know, the big banders you put on bulls to castrate them? Well, if you're standing there watching, you'll get a little foot stomp or something like that. Well, I decided I was going to hide in the scale house. And I got in this scale house before the cattle were brought up there. So they absolutely didn't know I was in this scale house. And this scale house looked out over the pen where they came out of the squeeze chute. And out of about 30 animals that got the band put on them, there was one where it really hurt. I call him pink ear tag. He had a pink ear tag. Pink ear tag was rolling around on the ground moaning. This animal's definitely in pain. I come out of that scale house, he just jumped up like everything was just fine. That was the example of them covering it up, and sheep are absolutely the worst. You want to really study pain behavior, you got to spy on them with video cameras. Or if you do it live, you got to make sure that the cattle don't know you're there. That's why I made sure I got in that scale house before the cattle were brought up. Okay, let's just get into some of my formal remarks I got on my slides. One of my students did some of the first work that showed that cattle that get excited in the squeeze chute, you see, when this research was done, we weren't allowed to say fearful. We weren't allowed to say that word. Journal article reviewers would go in and say, well, you got to write agitated or something like that. But these were animals that were jumping around in the squeeze chute. They had lower weight gains. And the animals that get agitated, fearful, they have poor reproductive performance. This has been totally replicated. And there's different ways you can measure animal behavior in squeeze chutes. How much they move around in the squeeze chute. That works well in manual squeeze chutes. It doesn't work very well in hydraulics. It holds them so tight you can't see differences in the movement. Exit speed, how fast they come out. You can measure that electronically. One of my students, Michaela Vetters, she's just finishing up vet school right now. She just did walk, trot, canter, and you could differentiate different cattle. And then you can also score flight zone in a pen. Now this is Bridget's original data from the first research we ever did on this. When we did this research, it was a long time ago. People thought I was crazy. They thought I was crazy that behavior in the squeeze chute could be related to weight gain. Now the ones that scored a 4, those are my berserks. Couldn't write that in the paper. Basically, my berserks. They went absolutely crazy. They had lower weight gain. Now there's an interaction with genetics. This is a really important thing. Okay, genetically flighty cattle, yeah, they get more upset. Where genetics makes a difference is when you suddenly startle an animal. Suddenly introduce something novel. Suddenly startle them. You're going to get a bigger reaction than with calmer genetics. Also, let's go back to the previous experience. What I'm going to predict, as Ed does more and more data, is you're going to have some horses that get scared more easily. In fact, the rodeo contractors avoid those because you can't transport them. You want an animal that's going to be nice and calm on the truck, not destroy your cattle trailer. That's what you don't want. And you have an animal with real flighty genetics, maybe they won't habituate. You see, there's an interaction between genetics and previous experience, especially when you force an animal to do something. Now, over the years, producers have been selecting beef cattle for calmer temperament. That's good, better weight gain, but we've got to be careful we don't lose foraging ability or mothering ability. Got to be really careful. Now, there's some temperament does not just equal mothering ability. There's some different traits in there, but be careful. Also, younger animals, if you're doing temperament scoring for genetics, you tend to get more accurate results because adult animals, they do learn. Now, the good news in cattle handling is handling at the feed yards has really improved. My student, Ruth Woolly went out to 28 feed yards and used the beef quality assurance scoring system and looked at cattle going through the squeeze chutes at the feed yards, and 4% electric prod score is super good. It used to be 500%. Now there's another study that Cassandra Tucker and her students have done that's just been published in the Journal of Animal Science on ranches. Hate to say it, 30 California ranchers. They need to be reducing their prod use. It was 23%. That's not something to be proud of. Vocalization scoring is a really good measure for assessing a real serious problem in handling. You squeeze an animal too hard in a hydraulic squeeze chute, he's going to moo and say, ouch. You zap it really hard with an electric prod, it's going to moo. So you've got mooing in the squeeze chute or going into the squeeze chute, you've got trouble. Now, obviously, you score this before you do branding or ear tagging or some aversive procedure. But an animal should not moo in response to being caught by the head gate. You nutcracker it across the head, it's going to moo. Or there's too much pressure. Cassandra Tucker found that hydraulic chutes had more mooing at the ranches. That was not true at the feed yards. All the feed yards in Ruth's study had a hydraulic squeeze chute, and the vocalization score was 1%. That's doing really super well. So why is the feedlot data better than some of the ranch data? Well, ranchers have been getting feed yard managers have been getting a lot more training in beef quality assurance. Packing plants don't like it when the injections are given in the wrong place, so there's been a much more emphasis on the BQA training. Now, the good news is out on the ranches that had BQA training had fewer miscuts. But the ranchers just haven't done as much beef quality assurance training. And Janice and I were looking last night online at NCBA now has the scoring system, the same scoring system here for cow-calf. I am a big proponent of scoring handling. You manage what you measure. Can you imagine what speeding would be like out on the highway if the police never measured it? never did anything about it, it'd be terrible. The thing I have found in training people in stockmanship is about 20% of people will just get it. They'll always be really, really super good stock people. And then you have a lot of other people you got to constantly supervise. And then there's a few people that maybe simply should not be handling animals. They just should not be there. Another thing on stockmanship, especially when you have large numbers of animals to handle, do not understaff and overwork. You know, somebody's worked a 10 or 12-hour shift. They're so tired they just don't care. But I like to measure handling, because then I can tell, am I getting better or am I getting worse? I'm going to be talking a little later on how a measurement system similar to this, very, very successful in the meatpacking plants. Now, there are advantages to acclimating animals to handling. This gets back to Ed Pager's previous experience. Really liked that graph. The eye temperature was half on the experienced animals. Well, that fits in with getting them accustomed to the handling. In the beginning, when they first go through those chutes, it's going to be scary. But then they learn exactly what they're supposed to do. And they don't use the bulls that are the fine bone, real flighty things, because they will get into accidents out in the trucks because they're not going to habituate. But there's some real advantages to acclimating animals to moving through the chutes. This is a research that's been done with pigs. I was just looking at some papers the other day with dairy cattle. One practice trip in the parlor actually probably might be better than 4 practice trips. Now today they're not giving any feed in the parlor. You put some feed, get some feed involved with going through handling facilities. I've trained sheep to line up for the privilege of getting on the till table. I mean the privilege. Just to get a little teaspoon of horse feed this big. I had to make sure it's a really tiny treat. But just that little tiny treat like that, so I had to make sure it wouldn't get sick, worked. This is a study where one of my students looked at these cattle that every day had to go through a squeeze chute for another study where they're given vitamin D in a bolus. Not exactly fun, but they were handled quietly, so the temperament score numbers went down. They were acclimating and habituating to the handling. Something that was uncomfortable, but it wasn't really painful. They can deal with uncomfortable, but you really hurt them, like these poor cattle that had been palpated too many times. It took 3 guys to get them out of the crowd pen. They absolutely were not going to go in that chute. It was just too horrible. Okay, some more recent studies on acclimation. Carol Petherick down in Australia, careful handling of lower cortisol. Cook's done work walking animals through the chutes. Beef cattle, Western ranches, improved the AI performance. And old studies have found the same thing. The old studies and the new studies have found that acclimating animals to procedures really makes a difference. And I think this is going to be found with the bucking bulls and the bucking horses. And then you don't want to have the absolute flighty genetics. They get so upset the first time they go through, they just don't get over it. Okay, sheep and cattle, 7th or 9th trip. It's less stressful than the first trip. That's cortisol measurements, that's habituation. Okay, now this is a really important thing. Animal memories are very specific. You feed cattle some feed out on the range. They get used to your truck, used to you there. That doesn't transfer over to the corrals. See, because their memories are a picture. This study I really like from Lehner and Fint from Germany. They habituated a horse to tolerate a blue and white umbrella suddenly opening. They go, oh boy, oh, we can throw a tarp around and everything's going to be fine. No, it's not going to be fine. Tarps and umbrellas look totally different. Their thinking is specific. Because what I found with my animals that went through the chute every 30 days, the few that got their head hit like this, they knew just which part of the chute was bad. They'd enter the squeezing part, then they'd get to the head gate and they're going like this. Their thinking is specific. It's sensory-based. It's not word-based. It's a picture. It's a sound. It's a touch sensation. You can get, I knew a horse that was terrified of black cowboy hats because during a veterinary procedure, somebody had chucked alcohol in his eyes and that person was wearing a black hat. White cowboy hat was just fine. And the position of the hat was important because when I put the hat down on the floor, on the ground, I got the horse to touch it. But as I brought the hat closer and closer to my head, I could feel the horse tense up because this was the bad thing. the black hat on the head. A common problem I'm seeing, especially with cattle off of western ranches, is that they've been exclusively handled by a man on a horse. Their flight zone might be this big to the man on the horse. But then when they meet their first man on foot at an auction market or a meat packing plant, their flight zone's from here to the store. So when you put them in a pen, they rebound out. Super dangerous. And they'll start racing back and forth. It's important for cattle where they're handled on horses to learn how to go in and out of a pen with people on foot. That is something they need to learn how to do before they leave the ranch. They're just super bad at the packing plant. And there was a hideous accident at one of the plants where the cattle went into a pen, rebounded out, and underneath the cattle was a 50-year-old cattle driver, stomped on, and died eventually. Really, really bad. Okay, acclimate them to different vehicles, different people. Some of the worst cattle to get upset when you take them to town are the ones that have led too sheltered a life. Now, especially if they have flighty genetics. See, back on the home ranch, they're just fine. But when they go to town, the one with the flighty genetics has a bigger reaction than maybe the Holsteins would have. See, that's just the difference in the temperament. Another important tip when you're working with animals, make sure those first experiences are good. First experience on a truck is good. First experience on the horse trailer, they're not flipping over backwards. First time you walk them through the corrals, you don't do anything to them. You just walk them through the chute, tie the back stops up, just walk them on through. So that those first experiences are good. Because if the first experience is atrocious, it's very difficult to get over it. There was an old experiment done by a guy named Miller that really showed this principle. And it's in one of my papers, Assessment of Stress During Handling and Transport. It's an old paper, but basically the premise of the paper is the animal's previous experience affects how it perceives things. And in this paper with rats, they had a radial arm maze, sort of a wagon wheel maze. So you drop the rat into the center of the maze. And the rat goes down this arm, yummy chocolate chips. Boy, junkies, junk food junkies. He'll go in there. But then if he goes into the second arm and he gets blasted with a gigantic shock, he'll never go in there again. But then on the third arm, he goes in, gets chocolate chips, yum. Goes in again, chocolate chips. Maybe the third trip in, he gets a tingle shock. And he goes, oh, well, those chips were good. I'll go in there. Then you gradually increase the shock to pretty bad. He'll still go in there. Yeah, the first experience, so let's make first experiences with new things good. Now, the thing about novelty is both scary and attractive. You want to round up the cattle, put some expensive camera equipment out on the pasture. I guarantee you, they are going to come up to that and they're going to knock it over for you. Guaranteed. Novelty is attractive when the animal is allowed to voluntarily approach. And it's scary when you just shove it in their face. And this is where you're going to see the differences in the genetics, the fearfulness. High fear animal, much bigger reaction. And I had an interesting trip this summer. I went down to New Zealand and I went out on a deer ranch. I've been on a deer ranch this summer, been on a deer ranch 30 years. And I was inside a small pen with mature deer. This pen was small. We were like from here to that fence. 30 years ago, they would have been over the top of you doing this. That's 30 years of temperament selection. There's no way they could have done that 30 years. They got rid of the dark house, the open tops on the corrals. You couldn't have done that 30 years ago. Now, the basic thing in this chart is when you force animals to do things, you get a lot more stress than when they do it voluntarily. So there's beef cattle with a bunch of rough handling. Then down here, I got a trained antelope. Nancy Earlbeck and I trained antelope at the Denver Zoo to go into a box for the privilege of having a blood test and having shots. And now this animal being so flighty, we had a very long habituation phase before we could do any operant conditioning. It took 10 days to train these antelope to not freak out when a sliding door opened. So we had a box, we trained them to go in. 10 days, put the box in the enclosure, just let them look at it. Another week, walking through the box. Then we moved the door like this much. Sliding door that you pull the rope, it orients. When it oriented like that, that's all we moved it. Because if you push it past that orienting phase, it's going to splat against the wall. Next day, it was open this much. Next day, this much. It took 10 days to train them to just tolerate the door being jerked open. So now we could get them to stand in the box, and then we got them to stand in there longer and longer times. They were so flighty. No one thought we could train them, but we did it. And then the babies now, they just train along with the mamas, and it's really easy now. Nobody thought that we could get blood samples out of unsedated Nyala and unsedated bongos. Fearful animals are less productive, and fear is a proper word. The thing that's interesting in science is for years, since the 60s, the fear word has been in the neuroscience literature. It's only been recently is it been allowed to be in the veterinary and the animal science literature. You know, now the reviewers aren't quite so much saying, I can't use that word that begins with F, but it is a proper scientific word. Paul Hemsworth years ago found fearful sows have fewer piglets. The sows just back off from you. People who like animals have more productive animals. There are scientific papers on this. Dairy cows that run away from people, lower conception rates. One of my students, Wendy Fullwider, found that dairy cows that approach people have lower somatic cell counts. Yeah, fear is really, really detrimental. I mean, the bottom line of this is stockmanship matters. But the thing I have found in my career is selling the thing, like the new parlor, the new cattle handling facility for a meat packing plant or a feed yard. That was a whole lot easier than doing the management. And when I was young, I used to think I could fix it all with engineering. Well, now I find out they only fix about half of the problems with engineering. Stockmanship matters. Ought to get a lot more respect. There's an example of some really nice low flight zone dairy cattle. That's what I like to see right there. Poor handling. Okay, when you're working in the feed yard, and these were some Hereford cattle, pretty tame Hereford cattle, and you force them to run and you kind of do some rough handling. And then Ruth went in there and stopped all the rough handling. Yeah, he had higher, they had lower weight gains. Bad handling hurts productivity. It's just that simple. And then there was a study at K-State. They took big fat feedlot cattle and they ran them all around. It's really, really detrimental, especially if they had high back fat. Don't recommend doing that. You know, bad handling of pigs, more downers, higher lactate. Yeah, rough handling's bad. Now we got science to show that should not handle animals roughly. Okay, Ruth also found that animals that accidentally got bumped on the chute like this, nutcrackered, they had lower weight gain. Ones that accidentally got smashed in the head. Okay, the last 5 minutes at the slaughterhouse, it matters. If you use a lot of electric prods in that last 5 minutes, you're going to have tougher meat and beef. Pigs, you're going to have more pale, soft meat, and you're going to have higher lactates. I got 4 refereed articles here, right here. You know, back up what I'm saying. Now, the good attitude. You've got the old Seabrook studies, and then you got Hemsworth stuff. There's a new Japanese paper on Stockman attitude, and it's a good effect on dairy cattle. All right, let's get into measuring welfare. The thing that frustrates me so much, and I've been around now for a long time, is it put something really nice in a packing plant or a feed yard. Half my clients tore up and wrecked it. Well, then I developed a very simple measurement system for slaughterhouses. And in 1999, I got the power of McDonald's behind me. And I saw more change than I'd seen in my whole career before that, because now they had to handle them right. The problem is, if you don't keep supervising it, handling's just like speeding. You know, if the police weren't out there, it would gradually go back bad again. You've got to prevent bad from becoming normal. All right, here's the animal handling scoring system for the ranch or the feed yard. How many run, how many fall, stumble, vocalize when you catch them, move with a prod. That's also in the beef quality assurance handbook. There's also differences in animals that are hard to handle. And animals can be hard to handle for different reasons. It can be wild due to lack of acclimation. Pigs, for example, differentiate between a man in the alleyway and a man in the pen. So if they meet their first person in the pen the day of loading, they're going to be squealing super glue. What you want to do with pigs, if you're finishing out pigs, is just quietly walk through their pens, get them accustomed to just quietly getting up and moving away. There's a whole lot of things that can make animals difficult to handle. Maybe they're lame, maybe they're stiff. But what I'm finding now at the packing plant, that when I find a welfare problem now at one of these big packing plants, it's something I have to fix at the farm. Pigs where the pens have not been walked. Super wild cattle just handling horses. Lame cattle. Weak old, horrible old dairy cows. Stuff like that. Something I got to fix outside the plant. Boy, the wild cattle thing in beef, I really going to go after that. The other thing is dogs biting cattle in the lead-up chute. That turns them into a double-barreled kicker at the packing plant. And twice I've almost had my head taken off. I came like that close to having it taken off. Okay, in 1996, I collected baseline data for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And only 30% of the plants could shoot 95% of the cattle dead with a single shot of a captive bull. You know why? Because it was broken. Broken equipment. That's management. Then we started scoring the plants. The 5 things that we scored them for, which was stunning percentage. That would be 95% or better. Everything dead when you hung it up. Vocalization, they were allowed 3%. Falling 1%, and prods up to 25% because it's a packing plant rather than a ranch. And we just held them to those numbers, plus no acts of abuse. Right now, the industry's running over 99% on stunning when they do things right. Now, this audit's based on things I can observe. You know what I'm concerned about now? I'm concerned about everything turning into a big, huge paperwork audit. They're writing all these SOPs, all these binders of garbage, I'm sorry. And when you go out to the plant, they're blindly following SOPs. I was at a place the other day that you've got a tool balancer for the stunner, little trolley that goes back and forth. And they put 2 trolleys on it. Well, that really goofed up because you got to push 2 trolleys back and forth. Well, somebody wrote an SOP for that. Well, it didn't really make very much sense. What I like to do is use the critical control point principle of what are the few important things to measure that really matter that I can measure pretty objectively using hazard analysis critical control points. I love that concept. What are the relatively few important things to measure? All right, let's use traffic, for example. Let's say we're only going to enforce 3 safety rules in traffic. What do you think they'd be? Speeding, drunk driving, and stop sign violations. And now I'm going to have to add texting. But if I just enforce those 4 things, I get almost all my safety. Those are the critical control point. Now there's different ways that you can audit stuff. You can use an animal-based outcome measure. That would be things like stunning score, the vocalization score, dead on the rail score, insensibility score. If you want to look at that guideline, it's on animalhandling.org. They are outcome measures because out of 75 plants, only 3 had to build something expensive. I did reverse conflict of interest. I had a conflict of interest. I sold equipment. But I was able to fix them with things like lights, non-slip flooring. I don't have a conflict of interest in mat companies and steel rod companies. It's an outcome-based variable. It's not telling them how to build a plant. Then they have some things you're not allowed to do. Okay, it's legal in the U.S. Hang cattle up by their ankle for kosher slaughter or for halal slaughter. Well, not in the industry guidelines. It's not legal. All right, so that's something would ban that. No, you've got to use a chute. You can't be hanging them up by the legs. That's also an OIE regulation to not do that. And we're getting away from telling them exactly how to build stuff. What kind of stun box to have or thing to have. It's an outcome measure. Can you shoot the 95% on the first shot? And it's going to get raised to something. Okay, let's look at on the farm. What are things that I would use for outcome-based variables? Lameness is a real good one. See, there's a difference between doing an audit and the veterinarians figuring out diagnosing the problem and fixing it. But lameness has a lot of different causes. So the important thing is, that's one of my critical control points on a dairy. I also want to look at body condition score. I want to look at swollen legs. There's a huge difference in swollen hocks between the best dairies and the worst dairies. Wisconsin's been doing a lot of work on improving things. I mean, the national average is like 23%. It's disgusting. That's the Van Kaiserlink paper. Cook 2 years ago, they've been working on that in Wisconsin. They've got it down to 13%. That's doing really good. But there's still, in that sample, a huge difference between the best dairies and the worst dairies. So I'm going to look at body condition score, lameness, Swollen legs, dirtiness, and then I have to have one input measure, ammonia levels. Boy, if that's 75 parts per million, somebody needs to fail an audit and fail it fast. Okay, things like chickens, for broilers, dirty. Any animal that's dirty is the problem. Then I can look at chickens, I can look at broken wings, I can look at breast blisters, hock burn, foot pad lesions. It's relatively few things, because what you don't want to have in an audit, and I've seen it, where they get enough points on the paperwork, you could have something like 20% badly swollen hocks and pass an audit. Somebody needs to fail an audit if they got 20% swollen hocks. Now the thing with these kind of measures is you're never going to have no lameness. That's not reasonable. Where do you set your standard? When I did the meatpacking plants one, I set the standard where the top 25% would pass. And it's been pretty stable. One concern I got right now in beef is I'm starting to see really bad leg problems, similar to what happened in the pig industry in the 80s. In the pig industry back in the 80s, and they're working on correcting this now, just selected for carcass traits, they got a lot of collapsed ankles. I saw some of the ugliest legs I've ever seen at the Colorado State Fair this summer down in Pueblo. I mean, just as straight as this. Those steers have been bulls, there's no way they could breed. No, leg conformation matters. What we got to make sure that we do is that we head off this problem at the pass. It's just starting now to show up in the feed yards, with cattle coming into feed yards, arriving at feed yards, being evaluated, just starting to see some post-legged collapsed ankles. And also, there's the pig with a hideous leg. One of my students saw a few of those recently. One of the big plants that's not okay, it's a defect. How about crooked claw, corkscrew claw? Starting to show up. And one of Marcy Franks, one of my students, looked at the bull pictures on the semen websites. And only 19% had fully visible feet and legs. Yeah, feet and legs matter. You know, if you just blindly follow carcass traits, you're going to get into trouble. Now, I'm all for power tools and genomics, that's fine. But be careful with a power tool. That circular saw can hack off your hand quicker than a handsaw will. Be careful with those power tools. And we still need to be looking at our animals to make sure they are physically sound. And you want to see some really ugly feet and legs. I got them on this phone. I can show them to you at the break. Hideous. Showing to everybody last night. And then, of course, you ban things like sticking something up the rear end, dragging downers. Now, there was a big argument, this is from a regulatory standpoint with the USDA, is when does tapping an animal with a plastic paddle become beating an animal? So I got a little video, proper use of livestock driving tools, and you've got to use those keywords. Proper use of livestock driving tools, and I whack a box really hard. When the empty box starts to break, the tappings become beating. And then you may have to have a few input requirements on things like water troughs. All right, now I just want to talk about some basic cattle handling things. Animal handling. Calm animals are easier to handle, period. Period. The trick is, don't get them all upset. When they get upset, it takes 20 or 30 minutes to calm down. Now the horse there is having a big, sudden novel event right there. And when it comes to calf roping, jerking down calves, I've been out on really good ranches that actually use roping. They don't jerk them down. They just don't. Fearful cattle. Ed talked a little bit about this. What are some of the signs that we can teach students to watch for that your animal will warn you before it kicks you or bites or does some other bad thing? For horses and cattle. Ears. Watch your ears. What are they looking at with their ears? Because they'll sort of have like ear radar. Ears pinned back. Pooping. You've scared the poop out of them. Tail switching. That's your first little warning that they're starting to get upset. When you get to eye white, they're really upset. And eye white is a scientifically validated measure. When you're out working cattle, let's look at some of the things with time of day lighting that can cause a problem. Right here, you're trying to get into the squeeze chute. You're going right into the rising sun there, blinded. Animals have a tendency to go towards the light, but they're not going to go towards blinding light. That's just not going to work. You might want to change the time of day that you handle them. There's a little white plastic jug there that was moving. There's, let's see, maybe I can get the, oh, no, I did the same thing Ed did. I just managed to turn my slides off. Guess it doesn't have a pointer. There's a car you can see through the fence. Get down in that chute and see what your animals are seeing. Be an observer. It's one of the things I really want to teach students. Be a good observer. Your animal stops in the facility. What is it looking at? Okay, move the vehicles. And Ron Gill from Texas A&M has a nice little piece of advice. You're bringing some animals up and the head is down, the lead animal's head is down. Wait until that head comes back up. They got 3 positions. Down looking at something, no go. Neutral, they'll go. Up like this, alert, they don't go. So wait until the head is looking straight forward, then they're going to go. I don't know why, after all these years, I still got to talk about chains hanging down in chutes, because people aren't taking them out. They're not seeing them. This is what I call the dark movie theater. Really sunny outside, we got to get them into this facility. They don't want to go in. Now at night, you can light it up with lights and it'll work just fine. This is going to work great at night, but on a sunny day, it doesn't work very well. Now you can take off some of the sheet metal so that they can see light. If they can see natural light through that building, they're going to go in a whole lot easier. They don't like going into the dark movie theater. There's your lead animal right there, looking at a puddle. Head's just about in the neutral position. You can start to push her forward. Now this cow right here is looking at me. See, I've talked a lot about the flight zone. You've got the flight zone. You enter the flight zone, the cattle move away. But there's a zone just outside the flight zone. I got 5 minutes, okay, I got to really hurry. Where they know you're there and they'll look at you. What you might want to do with that backstop is put a remote control rope on it, tie it open. Don't make them clunk through it. Bring small groups up to the crowding area. Good handling, it takes more walking. Fill your crowd pen half full, don't stuff it full. Also use following behavior. Wait until there's space in the chute, and then just bring your animals up, and they'll go right through the chute. There's the flight zone right there. Really see that. Okay, we gotta really hurry here. Black cattle moved away, I'm in the flight zone, but you see tan one there, he's looking at me? That's the zone just outside the flight zone. So the zone of influence, zone of awareness, or pressure zone. Different people call it different things. And the animal's far away, they don't even know I'm there. Here is the trick to get them in the squeeze chute without the electric prod. So now just imagine we've got cattle lined up right here like this. And I want to get the one right here in. So I just step like this, quickly walk back by the shoulder. This drawing's in my website, Grandin.com. It's on Grandin.com. It's in my books. It's on lots of different things. I'll draw it for you. You go inside the flight zone quickly in the opposite direction of desired movement. It works. Just try it out. And don't stand at the head of an animal and poke it on the butt. Now, this particular facility has an open fence. If you've got an open fence, sort of imagine a force field coming out of that fence. You've got to stay away from it, except when it's time to move them. You've got to stay back away from chute that's got an open side. And if you've got everybody around for a big party, then you better make a solid side. You know why that animal's rearing? Because the person's in the flight zone. He needs to back off. I also can see that he's carrying an electric prod. Electric prod should never be a primary driving tool. Never, never, never. Sometimes you might have to use one to get it in the squeeze chute, but then put it away. How long should I make my chute? I should make it long enough to get some following behavior. You have something that's too cattle long, you don't get any following behavior. But you get them too long, you're going to get into trouble. Okay, here's another little trick. You got to stand close to that squeeze chute, and you'll be in the flight zone. Stick a piece of cardboard on the back half of that squeeze chute. Just try that. Okay, maybe I have to stop there. Okay, I thought you were giving me some signals. There's been a lot of controversy in the stockmanship handling world about open versus solid sides. Well, there's pros and cons to each. If you have an open side, you've got to keep this people-free zone. Sort of imagine they put out a force field, and you've got to stay away from it except when it's time to move them. It requires more skill. I wouldn't use this with super wild cattle. If you have less skilled people, then I'm going to put solid sides on it. If the cattle is super wild, I'll put solid sides on it. Okay, this shows in a meat packing plant, completely solid sides, a lot of commotion, a lot of unskilled people. I would just cover it up. Now, one of the reasons why a curved chute works is cattle have a natural behavior to go back to where they come from. They want to go back to where they come from. And if you put too many cattle in the crowd pen, they're going to turn around. Yeah, you don't want to do that. Proper layout, really important. Lay it out in a complete half circle. When they come up to the entrance of the chute, they got to be able to see a place to go. It cannot be dead-ended. Layout mistakes will absolutely wreck facilities. Here's the right layout. Come on around 180 degrees, and they run up the chute. But you see where the dotted line is? I bent it too sharply. That's not going to work. They want to go back to where they come from. You've got to lay things out right. This is a nice little simple design where you stand at the gate pivot. I got rid of all the catwalks. I'm finding I'm old now. I can't even get up and down off those catwalks anymore. But you can just stand there at the pivot, and they'll come right on around. If you have a system that works really badly, one little trick you can do is try working it from the other side. Then bring the cattle around in the other direction. They'll see a place to go. And the fences that are most important to make solid are outer perimeters. So when all the vehicles are parked along it, it's got a solid outer side. Here's another one taking advantage of that same principle of going back to where you come from. And then some of you may have heard about the bud box layout. This is an example of a layout that's very economical to build, but a lot more skill dependent. Basically what you do, run the cattle in there, then you stand in there, the cattle circle around and go up the chute. So you're using that same principle of going back to where you come from. Do not overload this. You'll be in a lot of trouble if you do that. You know, this is something, if you have tame cattle, you've got portable paddles you're moving around, this might be a good option. If I've got a lot of labor turnover at a large feed yard, probably not such a good option, because it's going to require more skill to use. Now, some people today are saying, let's use no driving aids at all. Well, there's some merit to that, because people always want to do this. I went out to a feed yard that would have passed a BQA audit just fine, really, really good. There was this one guy up on the chute just doing this with a flag, just going like that. And they had zero falling, zero prod use, and I had him move, and he was squirting the grubicide medicine on him. I had him move over by the single animal scale, so just put the medicine on like that, and the whole room quieted down. Simple change. See, that's going from good handling, the handling was definitely acceptable, to the art of stockmanship. Changing this one little small detail. Okay, so what are some of your design concepts? I can make something simple, inexpensive, but it requires more skill. Or I can make something more expensive, but unskilled people can use it more easily. Talking to people down in Texas, I found that in feed yards that have a bud box, it takes more time to train somebody to use it than using a tub that's laid out correctly. But I want to emphasize with both systems, layout mistakes can really wreck things. Really, really wreck it. Some behavioral principles of restraint. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of non-slip flooring. Cannot emphasize that enough. You've got cattle that are just going like this, they're going to be freaking out. I've been in so many places where we just fix the flooring with a rubber mat. Makes all the difference in the world. Get rid of the dogs around the chutes. Just teach kicking. Okay, there's a very nice double D family mat there that animal's walking out on. Now, let's see how good you are at observation. Raise your hand if you saw that animal was looking at the sunbeam. You know what? When I show these slides to elementary school kids, I show the same slide. Half the kids see it. So you're getting beat out by elementary school kids. That's language covering up visual thinking. See, I'm a total visual thinker. And so when I first started working with cattle, I got down in the chutes to see what they were seeing. It seemed obvious to me. Well, now I'm learning why it was so, people thought it was crazy when I first started doing this, because they were not visual thinkers. That's my website, Grandin.com. Lots of free information on that. Got some stuff on there in Spanish too. And I hope we have some time for some questions. But I was getting a signal to hurry up, so that's what I tried to do.
We have time for questions, but not now, because you have a whole chunk of time afterwards.
All right, okay.
So I think we're taking a break.
Yes.
We're taking a break. I think we have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Anybody who's interested, there's